Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today I'd like to speak about the kingdom fungi or kingdom fungi. As you recall, the 6 kingdoms that we talked about before included the prokaryotic kingdoms of kingdom Archaebacteria and the Eubacteria, and the eukaryotic kingdoms including the protist, the fungi, plants, and kingdom of animals or kingdom Animalia. Hitherto we have already spoken about the kingdom Protista, which included the animal-like protists, the plant-like protists, the algae, and the fungus-like protist. And if you remember, the defining feature of the fungus-like protist was that they produced spores. The life of the inhabitants of kingdom fungi, therefore, is around the spores, or that's how at least they are categorized. So these are the 5 main phylum of this kingdom that we should talk about. If you observe the names of these categories, they all end with the word mycota. This is the Cytridiomycota, Zygomycota, Ascomycota, Basidiomycota, and Deuteromycota. The word mycota refers to the kingdom fungi. So basically it's another name for a fungus. So Cytridiomycota is a type of a fungus phylum. And so these are all very easy to recognize, these phyla. And the first part of these names nearly always refers to what type of spores they produce. So that's how these phylums are named. The Cytridiomycota, in fact, is a new classification. These were previously thought to be protists, which have been now classified as fungi because their DNA analysis apparently reveals that they're closer to fungi than they are to protists. So anyways, and in fact, they are the only fungi, apparently, that produced motile spores. So that's a very interesting phylum, the Cytridiomycota. The other ones we're more or less familiar with, the Zygomycota, and the inhabitants of this phylum are known as zygomycetes or zygomycetes, and the inhabitants of the phylum Ascomycota are called ascomycetes, etc. So these are the 5 phylums that we shall study briefly individually. The phylum Cytridiomycota, the Zygomycota, Ascomycota, Basidiomycota, and Deuteromycota. Some of these are very familiar to us. The star inhabitant of the zygomycetes are the bread mold, the common bread mold, the fungus that you see on bread, whose official name is Rhizopus stolonifer. That's the scientific name for that kingdom. Now, so it's thought that the original of the fungi phylum were indeed the Cytridiomycota, and they had flagellated spores, as I said. Once they lost the flagella, they grew up into these different categories of the fungi kingdom. And you notice over here one particular absent category, and that is this very last category, the Deuteromycetes or Deuteromycota. And it's hard to ignore this category, though, because it includes penicillin. But they actually do. The penicillin fungi actually does not have a sexual phase, so it's not considered a true fungi in a sense. But anyways, these are just highlighting the taxonomy or evolutionary heritage of these fungi. As I've suggested, the fungi's phylum are classified according to the spores that they produce, or the key reproductive feature that they have. The Cytridiomycota, or the citrates of fungi, they produce motile spores which have a flagella. The Zygomycota, which are like the bread mold we talked about, they produced a very different type of a spore from an organ called zygosporangium in their sexual stage. And then there is the sac fungi, the Ascomycota, and they produce their spores in sac-like structures like these. And then there's a Basidiomycota, they're called club fungi. They produce their spores externally on club-shaped structures that look like this. So the way these are categorized or separated is by the predominant way they produce their spores. And this is just a representative sample of one of each category, because in particular there are thousands of species in each particular phylum. So here again are the 5 phylum that we shall study in the kingdom fungi: the Cytridiomycota, Zygomycota, the Ascomycota, Basidiomycota, and Deuteromycota. If you say that enough, it becomes reasonably easier. So fungi, as you know, they are everywhere, and there's some, and they're very particularly important to us. For example, you have on the top left, you see some fungi are airborne, such as the Aspergillus, and people can inhale Aspergillus spores, and people can get Aspergillus pneumonia and Aspergillus infection in their body. Fungi are in the basement, in the molds in the wall. They are in gardens, sometimes intentionally to make them look pretty. And of course, the bread mold. So they're kind of everywhere. But fungi in general, they kind of get, a bad rap in that sense, right? And there's this poisonous fungi, so they seem to have this negative reputation. But you really just have to know your mushrooms in a way, to know the poisonous one from the ones that are not poisonous, and then you're good. I'm just kidding, of course. In this picture, they both look the same. My saying is the mushroom in the wild mushrooms, the only safe mushroom is the one that you find on your pizza or in your friendly neighborhood store. So anyway, but fungi variety, there are infinite variety of fungi. The bird nest fungi is very cute because they produce sporangium in these little cup-shaped things, and they kind of look like bird nests. Those are not eggs; those are reproductive structures of that fungus. And this is a cold fungi, and then that's the cold fungi. But if you remember, the defining feature of the fungi kingdom, their job description predominantly, although not all, as you will see, their predominant job description was that they were decomposers. Fungi, for the most part, yeast, for example, is not multicellular. The yeast that used to make the bread bloom, so to speak. But fungi, most of them are multicellular except for yeast, and they're heterotrophs. They are heterotrophs. No fungi is able to make their own food. No fungi does their photosynthesis, so they depend on other living things for food. They are heterotrophic decomposers. For example, they eat on fallen leaves, animal carcasses, and dead material, and sometimes even live material. So fungi's defining feature, therefore, is that predominantly they are nature's great decomposers, along with the bacteria. So fungi are multicellular. Most of them are multicellular, heterotrophic decomposers. So the concept of spore, as I said, is very central to understanding kingdom fungi. So let's explore some of these concepts. So let's start from a spore. Spores, if you like to think of it, is kind of like a seed, right? So you take a spore, like as you can take a spore from like a bread mold, and you can take a spore and put it, and it lands, for example, in a hospitable environment where there's food for the fungus to eat. Of course, if a spore lands on granite, it's not going to do anything. But if a spore lands on bread, it's going to grow because it has the requisite nutrition. So when a spore, the seed, so to speak, of the fungi, lands on a particularly hospitable environment, it grows, and it grows into this filamentous hyphae. See, a spore doesn't grow like a tadpole, a spore doesn't grow like a tree. It grows in this very peculiar fungus fashion, and the fungus grow in filament, like a little thread-like hyphae. This is a thread-like multicellular structure, and these thread-like multicellular structures, they grow into a network called the mycelium. So a spore will grow into a hyphae, which is like a little thready material, and the hyphae will form this web of material, a network of this hyphae, thread-like material, and that's called a mycelium. So these are important words. So spore will grow into a hyphae, and the hyphae will grow into a mycelium. And that's what, when you look at a mold on a bread, you're basically visualizing the macroscopic mycelium. All right. So, and then what happens is not all hyphae are the same. See, some of them take on special characteristics or special roles. So some hyphae, for example, will anchor the mycelium. They'll anchor the mold. Some of the hyphae will grow, kind of dig their roots into the bread, for example, to anchor the mold. Some of them will actually invade the food source and get the nourishment for the fungus, and others will form reproductive structures in foreseeing the future generation of the fungus. And these reproductive structures, and you will not be surprised, they are the ones that will produce the next generation of spores. So now, so when a spore germinates, when a spore lands on, let's say, on a particular area and starts growing, it elongates like this, and then after it elongates, these little walls start to form periodically, and they entrap, so to speak, a bunch of nuclei. And these walls are called septae. And the septae are pores. There are holes in between them, so things can flow. The traffic can go from one area to other area. So a hyphae is basically a sequence of multinucleated cells separated by periodic septae or walls. So here's a spore going into a hyphae, and then you can see over here septae separating each individual. In this cartoonist picture, there's one nuclei, but oftentimes there could be more than one nuclei in each little structure. So the major feature of fungi, hyphae, are divided into cells by cross walls that are called septae. So here's a cytoplasm. You can see multiple nuclei in each of these cells, which are separated by septae. And some fungi, on the other hand, like this one over here, they can be aseptate, or that is, they do not have a separate. They do not have separation of cells. And septa allow nutrients, septa being singular of septae, septa allow nutrients and cytoplasm and organelles to flow between cells. So it is some compartmentalization in these individual cells, but there's also a remarkable degree of sharing between cells in the fungus. Now, so here's a picture of a septate hyphae, or a hyphae that has a septa, and there's nuclei, as you can see over here. Now, fungi have a cell wall, but the cell wall of fungi is not the same as the cell wall that you find in plants. In fact, when we say cell wall, that's a very broad statement. The cell wall that's found in bacteria is different from the cell wall that's found in plants, which is different from cell wall that's found in fungus. The cell wall of that's found in plants is made of cellulose, but the cell wall that's found in fungi is made of chitin, which is actually very similar to what some critters use for the exoskeleton. Anyway, the cell wall of fungus is made of chitin, which allows is very strong, but yet it allows them to be flexible, whereas the cell walls of plants are made of cellulose. So the flexibility of the fungi is related to a different cell wall structure compared to the flexibility of plants. That's one unique feature of the fungi. Now, when you see a mushroom is here's a mushroom that's sprouting. So you're walking by and you see a mushroom. What you see of a mushroom is the mycelium, that part of mushroom that is above the ground. As much of the mushroom is above the ground, so that much more of the mushroom is also below the ground. In fact, the mushroom, the part of the mushroom, the part of the fungus that's above the ground, the part of the mushroom that's above the ground, the mycelium that's a part of, is the spore-producing specialized structures. Okay, that's like its reproductive body of the fungus. So what you see of the fungus that's above the ground, what you and I think of a typical fungus, are the hyphae that are coming out of the ground and to do their specialized function, which is to produce spores. So that's the function of the actual, what we think of as a typical fungus. So the underground is the mycelium, and above ground are the hyphae with specialized structure that will go on to produce the future generation of spores. Now, these are time-lapse pictures, but just to remind me of the fact that fungus can grow very quickly, like overnight. They can like sprout, and some of this remarkable growth that occurs in fungi. It's like you walk in there one day, it's like, where did these come from? I don't think I saw these fungi here yesterday. And it's very possible that you didn't. They actually do grow pretty fast. And some of their growth is actually just elongation of cells and not necessarily cell division, because cell division is what actually takes time. How do fungi eat? How do they get their food? Well, fungi are heterotrophs. They don't make their own food, so they have to get their food. They don't go eat like other things, like animals eat. So what they do, in fact, is they release chemicals. So the hyphae, these hyphae, so what happens is fungi, they relieve digestive enzymes from these hyphae over here. In other words, they squirt out their digestive enzymes to whatever material that they want to digest. So whatever this fungus, let's say this fungus is on a dead log over here. So it squirts out the digestive enzyme to its dead body over here, so to speak, of this plant, and enzymes digest the material, and once they digest the material, then the digested material is absorbed into the fungus as a nutrition, and that spreads, and the fungus can grow and do its good thing. Now, fungi can interact with other living things around them in 3 different ways. First and foremost, and like, as I said, it's like their job description, they are saprophytic. They're saprophytes, that is, they're decomposers. So it's almost like their job description. They are decomposers. They take the nutrition from dead organic matter. But other fungus, they live in a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. That is a symbiotic relationship where both of the organisms benefit. In other words, many fungi live in harmonious relationship with other living things without damaging them. And there are some fungi that are parasitic. Parasitic symbiosis is when a fungus eats a living thing. See, a decomposer waits for the living thing to die, and then it eats it. That's a decomposer, a saprophytic decomposer. A parasitic infection, a symbiosis, is when one living thing eats another living thing. So that's parasitic fungi. That's how they work. So parasitic fungi, they produce specialized structures called Haustoria, Haustoria, which are like finger-like projection, basically, that dig into their host that's alive, and they do the same thing. They squirt their digestive enzyme outside, and then they absorb the nutrients. So here, what you see before you is a saprophytic fungus. That's a decomposer. And here's a tree that you see on the right side that has fungi over there. And as you can imagine, the place to find fungus would be where you have dead organic matter. So that's a saprophytic fungi eliminating the tree and recycling the nutrients back into the environment. This, on the other hand, is a mutualistic relationship. What you see over here in the rocks over there on the right side is lichen. Lichen is actually not a plant. Lichen is a combo living organism. A lichen is a mutualistic symbiosis between a fungus and a photosynthetic algae, protozoan, or sometimes even cyanobacteria. So a photosynthetic microorganism, whether it be a cyanobacteria or photosynthetic protozoan or algae. So if you recall, there are some bacteria, the cyanobacteria, that are photosynthetic, and if you recall, there are some protozoans that are photosynthetic, and we call them algae. So lichen, and there are many different kinds of lichen, and they're different, and they're different colors too, and then very beautiful bright colors depending on the photosynthetic pigment component that constitute the photosynthetic element of this. So a lichen is a combination of fungus plus either a photosynthetic algae or a photosynthetic cyanobacteria. So it's a combination organism, and they're living in a mutualistic or symbiotic, symbiotic relationship where both benefit. In this case, if you were to examine this lichen, if you were to peel it off and take a cross section of it, this is what you would see. You will see a layer of hyphae which kind of protect the inner inside of this. So you see a layer of fungal hyphae which sandwich in between them photosynthetic elements. In this case, it's going to be the algae layer. Each of these are the little photosynthetic algae cells, the protozoan algae cells, and they're actually underneath this protective fungal hyphae layer. So the hyphae, the fungal hyphae, provide a bedrock, so to speak, provide a bed where these photosynthetic algae or cyanobacteria can find protection. So they're not protection from water, from other living things, from being washed off by water or wind, etc. So they find a place to live. So they find a home and support. And the fungus, what do they get out of it? Well, they get out of it all the products of photosynthesis. So whatever the photosynthetic material that's produced by the photosynthetic algae and cyanobacteria, they share that, of course, with the fungal element, and so they get the nutrition. So it's kind of like the rent or the tax that they pay to the fungus for living in their beautiful hyphal nest, so to speak. So this is an example of mutualistic symbiosis and lichen and fungi. So this is the algae cell, this is a scanning electron micrograph, and the fungal hyphae. And these are very easy to find, and you see this on trees, like, you can probably walk out right now and find these lichen. The curious thing about lichen is that the photosynthetic element of the lichen derives everything that it needs for photosynthesis from the air. In other words, of course, the carbon dioxide, but also the moisture in the air. That's why it's able to live on rocks, because there's no roots that dig into the rock. Like the plants have roots that dig into the soil for the nutrients and stuff, right? So obviously the lichen does not have roots that go into the rock, but there's no nutrients that they can get from the rock. So everything that the photosynthetic aspect of this plant needs, it gets from the surrounding air. And therefore, they are very sensitive to environmental changes, as you can imagine, because everything that they need comes from outside them, from the air. So for that reason, in fact, you won't see as much lichen in the cities, because of the pollution acts as a toxin for them. So if you go in a suburban neighborhood, you find a little bit of green and you'll see lichen. But if you go in a city area, if you see a park and stuff, you may not necessarily see lichen over there if it's a polluted area. So it acts as a biomarker for the health of the air, in fact. So that's lichen. There's another symbiotic relationship that occurs in actually majority of the plants. Majority of the plants participate in a symbiotic relationship with fungi in the form of what's called mycorrhizae. Now, what happens is, this is a plant, for example, corn plant, whatever plant it is, And in the roots of the plant, the fungi element, they grow into the roots of the plant. So it is kind of like, you know how some people have extensions to their hair? It's kind of like that. So this is like extensions to the roots of the plant. And what that does is it increases the surface of the roots. So as you can see, the fungal, they're like the mycelium of the fungi is like a maze of roots, of hairy roots, and then and increases the absorptive area for water for a plant and for minerals for the plant. So it's like an awesome thing for a plant to have, is just to increase the surface area of its roots. And so fungi attach to the roots and increase the surface area of the roots. Now, what do fungi get out of this? Well, the same thing that they get from the algae and the lichen and the cyanobacteria and the lichen, and that is whatever the plant is going to make. And what do plants do? They do photosynthesis, so they get nutrition. So fungus, they're not always parasitic in a way. They're kind of like, okay, you scratch my back, I scratch your back. You grab onto my roots, and I'll give you some glucose type of thing. So that's what they do. So the mycorrhizae are very important. In fact, some 80 to 90% of the plants have some fungal mycelium increasing the surface area of their roots. And here's a mycorrhizae. See, how do they do? They attach. They literally attach. They dig their roots into the roots of the plant, and same way they secrete digestive enzymes and they absorb the nutrients from the roots without destroying the roots. So that's that. As I've also suggested, the fungi can be parasitic. Parasitic fungi, they eat things that are while they're still alive. It's like the plant is not even dead. It's the guy says, hey, I'm still alive, but I don't care. I'm going to still eat you. So that's what they do, parasitic fungi. So here's a parasitic fungi. This is called a shelf fungi, apparently. And it is dug its root inside, and it's going to do the same thing. So it's going to excrete the digestive enzymes into this tree that's alive, and the enzymes degrade the structures, and the mush that's as a result that occurs is digested and absorbed back into the hyphae, and that's how they grow. All right, so here's a fungal hyphae, microscopic hyphae that you might see over there, and with the septa here, acute septa, and they have these elements called a haustorium. That's the haustorium. They literally go inside of the other plant cell like this. They grow into this plant cell, and they squirt their enzymes out, and they eat up the nutrition from the plant cell. So that's how those are the different types of relationships that for fungi, the heterotrophic fungi, have with other living things. They can be decomposers, saprophytic. They can be mutualistic relationship like lichen, or they can be parasitic. They can have parasitic relationship with other living things. Now, how do fungi reproduce? Okay, they're as we started this conversation, we said they are spore makers, right? That's correct. But fungus can also reproduce in other ways. One way fungus can reproduce is by fragmentation. That is, if you take a hyphae, and if you cut the hyphae and then you put the little hyphae somewhere else, the two resulting hyphae can independently produce other hyphae and mycelium. This process is called fragmentation. This is not unique to plants. In fact, there are some species, and not all species, there's some species of plants where you can take a twig and you cut the twig and you put the twig in the ground, and the twig grows into a plant, and that's not always the case. Not all plants are able to do that, but the plants that are able to do that, and this phenomenon is called fragmentation, where you take a part of the plant and that part can give you a new plant. And here in this case, you take a fungus and the septa, you cut the fungus, and then the new the cut out hyphae can give rise to another mycelium like this. So asexual reproduction can occur by fragmentation. Asexual reproduction can also occur by a process called budding. Budding is kind of like what bacteria do. They divide into two, right? So in bacteria, that's called binary fission. Okay, the budding is slightly different than that phenomenon, although conceptually it's not very different. So here's a nucleus, and the nucleus divides you into two. And then what happens is one side of the yeast elongates like this, and then the genetic material goes in there. It forms this bud. So that's why it's called budding. And the bud forms, and then and eventually the entire genetic material migrates into the daughter cell, and then the daughter cell leaves the parent cell. So the process is conceptually similar to binary fission in bacteria, but morphologically different, as you can see. So this is all asexual reproduction. Yes, fungi do asexual and sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction, if you remember, is dividing and forming a new generation of living things without enriching or without changing the genetic material. So spore formation asexual spore formation can also occur. So again, asexual reproduction of fungus can occur with fragmentation. It can occur with budding process as in yeast, and it can occur in spore formation. Most fungi, as we've said, produce spores. Now, spores result from specialized hyphae. So remember, this is like the average Joe hyphae, like this, all right? It's kind of average Joe hyphae. And then there's some specialized hyphae. And they say, well, I'm not going to be average Joe, I'm going to be specialized hyphae like this. And these specialized hyphae then grow, and they produce these structures at the tip of them. And those are the structures, and these are the spore-forming structures, and these are called the sporangium sacs. Spore sacs or sporangium sacs. So the specialized hyphae produce these sacs called the sporangium sacs, and that's where the spores are produced. So here's a sporangium sac, and with the whole bunch of these spores over here, and the spores are released, and the spores are very tiny things, and they're very light, and that's advantageous because that helps in their dispersal. Some fungi produce, some of these sacs produce like thousands of spores, whereas other sacs produce few spores, like 8 spores, as we will see. So some of these sacs produce very few spores. Some of them produce them by the thousands, and they're helped in dispersion. This is a bread mold sporangia, and if you were to look at bread mold microscopically, that would be the spore-producing structure of the bread molds. This fungus over here, this is a puffball, which is apparently about 25 centimeters in circumference, and each of them puffballs apparently produces 1 trillion spores. I think that's like way more than even a frog laid eggs. You know what I'm saying? It's like it must be some kind of a record. But the spores are important because they're very sturdy structures. If you remember, they protect the genetic material from drying out, and they're because they're so light, they're easy to disperse by wind and water and other animals. They can get stuck into the fur of other animals and go and have a new colony of fungi miles away. So those are all preliminary remarks about fungi. We talked about the basic structure of fungi, how it starts off from a spore, which results in hyphae, which results in mycelium. We talked about the different relationships that fungi have with other living things, including a saprophytic relationship, where they act as decomposers, and including a mutualistic relationship, such as in lichen, and also a parasitic relationship where they actually eat other living things, other plants, by having finger-like extensions into the living tissue of the plant, and these extensions are called haustrums. So those were all preliminary remarks about this remarkable kingdom of fungi. Inshallah, next time we shall talk about each of these categories of fungi in slightly more detail. Until then, as-salatu was-salamu ala rasulillah walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.